The rain started on the morning we buried my wife, Dorothy, and it didn't stop for 3 days. I remember standing at the graveside in my black suit, the one she'd picked out for me 11 years ago when we went to her sister's wedding in Nashville. She'd smoothed the lapels with both hands and said, "Walter, you look distinguished." I told her distinguished was just another word for old. She laughed, the way she always laughed, with her whole body, her shoulders shaking, her eyes disappearing into crinkles. I never told her how much I lived for that laugh. The minister said his words. The grandchildren stood in a row near the tent. I stared at the mahogany casket and tried to feel something that wasn't just cold. 68 years on this earth, 41 of them spent beside that woman, and now I was supposed to just stand here in the rain and accept that she was gone. I felt a hand on my arm. I thought it was my son Brandon, coming to offer some comfort. I turned, and it was him. But he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at his phone, typing something with his thumb, his jaw tight. Beside him stood his wife, Nicole, holding a small black umbrella over her own head while the rain soaked the left shoulder of my suit. She glanced at me once, then looked away. That was the moment, though I didn't know it yet. That was the moment everything began. Dorothy had always been the one who saw people clearly. She'd look at someone once and know. She told me about Nicole 2 years into Brandon's marriage. We were sitting on the back porch after Sunday dinner, and she said quietly, "Walter, that woman is keeping score." I told her she was being unfair. Dorothy just nodded the way she did when she knew she was right and was willing to wait. She waited 6 years. Then she got sick. Pancreatic cancer moves fast. From diagnosis to that graveside in the rain was 7 months. 7 months of watching the strongest person I knew get smaller and quieter and further away. During those months, Brandon and Nicole moved into the house. They said it was to help. Nicole set up a system, she called it a care schedule. That meant someone from their side of things was always present. Always. The first week I thought it was kindness. By the third week I started to notice things. Phone calls I didn't know about. Visitors who came to see Dorothy and left looking uncomfortable. Our family attorney, Raymond Howell, called the house once, and Nicole answered and told him I was resting and couldn't be disturbed. I was sitting 12 feet away in the kitchen eating soup. I called Raymond back the next morning from my cell phone, standing in the driveway in my bathrobe. "Walter," he said, "I've been trying to reach you." "I know," I said. "Talk to me." He talked. I listened. When I went back inside, Nicole was making coffee and smiling at me from across the kitchen counter, and I smiled back. And I kept everything Raymond had told me locked in a place behind my eyes where nobody could see it. Dorothy passed on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The house got very quiet after that. Brandon and Nicole stayed. They said the estate needed to be settled. They said I needed support. They said a lot of things, and I let them say them, and I went to bed at 9 o'clock every night and lay in the dark, thinking about Raymond's voice on the phone and what I'd set in motion the morning I'd called him from the driveway. The grief was real. I want to be clear about that. I missed my wife every single hour. I'd reach for her side of the bed before I was fully awake and hit the cold, empty sheet, and the weight of it would settle on my chest like something physical. I missed the sound of her moving around the kitchen in the morning. I missed the way she read flat on her stomach on the couch with her feet up, like a teenager. The grief was real, and it was enormous, and it didn't go away. But grief and watching are not the same thing. I had learned, somewhere in those 7 months, how to do both at once. Brandon sat down with me 2 weeks after the funeral. He had a yellow legal pad and a pen and a manner that reminded me of the way he'd presented school projects as a boy, chin up, voice steady, very rehearsed. He said the business needed to be restructured. We owned a regional hardware supply company, the kind of business my father had started in 1962, and I had rebuilt from near collapse in 1991. It employed 43 people. It had carried our family through every hard year and put Brandon through college and bought the house where his mother died. He said the restructuring would be more tax efficient. He said the current ownership model created unnecessary exposure. He used words like liquidity event and legacy planning and watched my face while he said them. I asked him what he was proposing. He slid a document across the coffee table. I picked it up. I read it slowly. I set it down. The document proposed transferring majority ownership of the company to a new LLC to be controlled jointly by Brandon and Nicole. I looked at my son across the coffee table, and I thought about the day he was born, the way I'd sat in that hospital waiting room for 9 hours afraid to even breathe wrong, and then the nurse came out and said everything was fine, and something in me had shifted permanently. The way tectonic plates shift slow and irreversible and total. I had loved this man before I even saw his face. I told him I needed time to review it. He said that was completely reasonable. Nicole appeared in the doorway of the living room. She had a mug of tea, and she was leaning against the frame with a small, patient smile. 3 days later, I called Raymond. The weeks after that were a kind of theater. I played the role of the grieving, slightly confused older man. I asked Brandon to explain things twice. I misplaced papers Nicole handed me. I forgot appointments. I shuffled in my slippers and went to bed early, and let them think that 7 months of watching my wife die had softened whatever I'd once been. Meanwhile, Raymond worked. He worked in his office 3 miles away, and he did not call the house landline. What nobody knew, not Brandon, not Nicole, not anyone, was that Dorothy had known too. She had known for longer than I had, because she was sharper than I was and had always seen people clearly. In the last 2 months of her life, on the days when she had the energy, she had sat with Raymond by video call and done something careful and deliberate and entirely hers. I didn't know the full shape of it until Raymond laid it out for me on that driveway, in my bathrobe, in October. The inheritance meeting was scheduled for a Thursday in January. Brandon arranged it. He booked the conference room at Howell and Associates himself, which I found interesting since it was my attorney's office, but I said nothing. He told me we'd be reviewing the estate documents and discussing next steps for the business. He said it in the tone of someone who already knew how a meeting would go. Nicole wore a cream blazer. She had her hair done. She brought a leather portfolio. I wore the black suit from Dorothy's sister's wedding. Raymond's paralegal offered coffee at the door. We sat down around the oval conference table, Brandon and Nicole on one side, me on the other, Raymond at the head. There was a man I didn't recognize sitting against the wall with a notepad. Brandon introduced him as Marcus, a business consultant Nicole had brought. I nodded at Marcus. Marcus nodded back. Raymond opened a folder. Brandon leaned forward slightly. Nicole uncapped a pen. Raymond said, "Before we begin, I want to make sure everyone understands the scope of today's meeting. We're here to review the estate of Dorothy Ann Mercer and the standing arrangements regarding Mercer Supply Incorporated and associated assets." He paused. "Walter, would you like me to begin with Dorothy's trust documents?" I said yes. Brandon said, "Actually, Ray, I think we should start with the business restructuring proposal. I sent you the draft last week." Raymond looked at him over his reading glasses. "We'll get to that, Brandon." Nicole put her hand on Brandon's arm. A small gesture. Patient. She was so sure of how this was going to go. Raymond began to read. He read for 4 minutes. He read about the Dorothy Ann Mercer Living Trust, established 14 months prior, amended 7 months prior, witnessed and notarized and entirely and unambiguously legal. He read about the assets held within it. He read about the conditions of distribution. Nicole's pen stopped moving. The house Brandon and Nicole had been living in for 7 months. The house my father had built additions onto in 1974. The house where Dorothy had grown tomatoes in the side yard every summer for 30 years was held in the trust, not in my name alone, where it might be subject to pressure or persuasion. In the trust, with conditions. The business Mercer Supply Incorporated, 43 employees, founded 1,962, rebuilt 1,991 was held in the trust. Management authority remained with me. Succession was designated to a board of 3, none of whom were Brandon, none of whom were Nicole. Brandon said, "Wait." Raymond kept reading. He read about a provision Dorothy had added in the final amendment 7 months ago, from a hospital bed with an IV in her arm and her handwriting shakier than I'd ever seen it, but her mind as clear as January water. The provision established a separate educational fund. The beneficiary of that fund was a child named Lily, 6 years old, currently in 1st grade, currently living with Brandon and Nicole. Lily was not their biological daughter. I watched Nicole's face when Raymond said that. Lily had been placed with Brandon and Nicole through a private foster arrangement 3 years ago, when she was 3 years old. I had met her a dozen times. She was small and serious and loved dinosaurs and would show you her drawings if you sat with her long enough on the floor. Dorothy had loved her fiercely. Dorothy had, in fact, loved her in the specific way she loved people who needed someone in their corner. Nicole had been making noises in recent months about how the foster arrangement had become complicated, about how it might be better for Lily to be placed with a more stable situation. I had heard this and said nothing. I had not known at the time what Dorothy had done. What Dorothy had done was contact a family law attorney and a social worker and Raymond, and together they had constructed a legal mechanism by which I, Walter James Mercer, age 68, widower, was named as Lily's proposed permanent guardian in the event that the current foster placement dissolved, voluntarily or otherwise. The educational trust fund was mine to administer. It was substantial. It would cover Lily's schooling through college and beyond, regardless of what happened with the foster arrangement, regardless of what anyone else decided. Brandon stood up. He said my name. I looked at my son. I thought about the legal pad and the yellow document and the words liquidity event. I thought about Nicole answering the phone and telling Raymond I was resting. I thought about the umbrella at the funeral that covered one person's head while the rain soaked my shoulder. I said, "Sit down, Brandon." He didn't sit down. He said this wasn't what they'd discussed. He said I didn't understand what I'd signed. He said the trust had to be contested because clearly I'd been influenced by people who had taken advantage of my grief. Raymond put down his folder. He said very calmly, "Brandon, your mother amended this trust 7 months ago. I personally verified her cognitive capacity at the time of signing. Dr. Susan Alvarez of Mercy General also provided written attestation of that capacity, which is included in the document packet. You're welcome to contest it. That is your legal right. But I want you to understand what you would be contesting and what the likely outcome of that process would be." Nicole said nothing. She was looking at the table. Marcus, the business consultant, had stopped writing. Brandon looked at me. In his face I saw, for just a moment, something younger, something that looked like the boy I'd driven to Little League and stayed up with when he had the flu and taught to drive in the parking lot of an empty shopping mall on a Sunday morning. I saw that boy, and then it was gone. He said, "Did Mom know about all of this?" I said, "Your mother knew everything." There was a long silence. Nicole closed her leather portfolio. She gathered it against her chest like it was something she was protecting. I said, "I'd like to talk about Lily." Nicole looked up for the first time in several minutes. I said, "I've already spoken to the family law attorney and the social worker. There's a home study scheduled for next month. I'm told the process is straightforward given the existing documentation Dorothy put together." I paused. "I'm not doing this to take anything from you. I'm doing this because Lily is 6 years old, and she deserves someone in her corner. Your mother, my wife, made sure that would be possible. I intend to honor what she built." Nicole said very quietly, "We weren't going to abandon her." I said, "I don't know what you were going to do. I know what I'm going to do." Brandon and Nicole left the conference room before the meeting formally concluded. Marcus gathered his notepad and followed them without saying anything to anyone. Raymond took off his reading glasses and set them on the table. He looked at me for a moment. "Your wife was an extraordinary woman," he said. I said I knew that. I drove home through streets that were gray and cold and familiar. I parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a little while looking at the house where we'd raised Brandon, where Dorothy had grown tomatoes, where she'd spent her last months. The house that was mine to stay in, according to the trust, for as long as I wanted it. I thought about the first time I'd seen Dorothy. It was at a company Christmas party in 1981, and she was arguing with someone near the punch bowl about whether a particular movie had a good ending or a bad one. She had her arms crossed and her chin up, and she wasn't backing down. I stood nearby and listened for 10 minutes before I introduced myself. She shook my hand and said, "What do you think?" Like she'd known me for years. Like my opinion on the matter was something she'd been waiting for. I told her I thought the ending was ambiguous on purpose, and that ambiguity wasn't the same as a bad ending. She considered this for a moment. Then she said, "I can work with that." I sat in the car in the driveway and smiled at the steering wheel. The home study came back fine in February. The family law process moved the way Raymond said it would, steadily, without drama, with a lot of paperwork and a few hearings that were more procedural than contentious. Brandon and Nicole did not oppose it. I don't know what they told themselves about that decision. Maybe they'd found, somewhere in the aftermath of that January meeting, something that looked like a conscience, Maybe they just ran the numbers. I didn't ask. Lily moved in on a Saturday in March. She came with 2 suitcases and a backpack shaped like a triceratops, and a serious expression that I recognized. It was the expression of a child who had learned to assess new situations carefully before committing to them. I understood the logic of it completely. We stood in the front hallway and she looked around. I said, "Your room is the second door on the left. Your grandmother painted it yellow." She said yellow was the color of a person who has good ideas. Lily looked at me for a long moment. She said, "I have good ideas." I said, "I know you do." She went to look at her room. I stood in the hallway and listened to her footsteps on the stairs and the sound of a door opening. And the house, which had been so quiet for so many months, had something new in it. Something that wasn't memory, or grief, or the particular stillness of absence. Something that moved and took up space and had opinions about dinosaurs. I put the kettle on. The business continued. I went in 3 days a week. The 43 employees were still employed. The building my father had bought in 1968 still had the original sign on the front, faded now, the letters the color of old mustard, and I had always meant to replace it and had never gotten around to it, and now I thought maybe I wouldn't. Maybe I'd leave it exactly as it was. Brandon called me in April. It was the first time we'd spoken since January. The call was short. He said he was sorry. He said Nicole was sorry. He said they'd been under a lot of pressure and had made decisions they weren't proud of. He said he missed his mother. I said I missed her too. I said, "The door isn't closed, Brandon, but it doesn't open from my side." He said he understood. I don't know if we'll find our way back to each other. I have learned, at 68, that some things require more time than you think you have, and that the best you can do is leave the possibility open and tend to what's in front of you. What's in front of me is a yellow bedroom and a backpack shaped like a triceratops. What's in front of me is a company my father built, and I rebuilt, and that belongs, for now, to me. What's in front of me is Dorothy's tomato garden, which came back on its own in April. Volunteers from last year's plants, pushing up through the cold ground without any help from anyone, green and stubborn, and entirely themselves. I didn't plant them. She did. I put up the stakes and tied the first tendrils to the wire on a Saturday morning, while Lily sat on the back porch steps with a drawing pad and drew what she told me was a stegosaurus, but which had a suspicious number of horns. I said, "That might be a different kind of dinosaur." She said, "It's a new one. I invented it." I said, "What's it called?" She thought about it. She said, "Dorothy." I kept my hands on the tomato stakes and looked at the garden for a moment. The new leaves were very small and very green against the dark soil. The morning was cool, and the light was the kind of light that only comes in spring, slanted and clean, the kind that makes everything look like it's been washed. I said, "That's a good name for it." She went back to drawing. I went back to the garden, and we stayed there together in the good spring light, tending to the things that were left to us.